Good evening, everybody. I'm John O'Loughlin. Welcome to my channel. It's called McDuff Lives. And let's see, I just want a little housekeeping thing. Abe Baker says the link in the description doesn't go to a working link. I think we need to get another link up on Twitter. Aaron, if you wouldn't mind doing that while you're producing everything else so that folks know we're on. I think that's what the problem might be. Anyway, welcome to everyone, and thanks for being with us here on a Friday night, where we are continuing our series of Lend Me Your EIRs. Our friends from the Executive Intelligence Review, the Schiller Institute, and the Larouche organization have been joining us on Friday evenings, and we discuss different aspects of their work. And tonight, Mike Billington is joining us once again. Mike is going to talk to us tonight, primarily, I think, about what the heck is going to happen to Afghanistan. It's a terrifically huge problem, and it looks like President Biden is just going to leave it for the world to sort out. It's not our problem, according to the president. So with that and some other issues we'll be talking about, I'm very pleased to welcome to the show Mike Billington. Good evening, Mike.
Thanks, John. Glad to be here.
All right. Well, I'm glad that you are here too, and we are going to get right on into our subject matter. President Biden is pulling out of Afghanistan. Is it real? Is it? Are we really leaving, or are we going to just kind of leave and then really stay there? What do you think?
Oh no, I think they're pulling out, and of course, 20 years having achieved absolutely nothing, essentially having lost. It is, of course, welcome to get out. This is what Trump wanted to do, and his generals and the military-industrial complex told him to drop dead and refused to get out. So it's good to get out, but you don't just get out and leave a country which is still infested with not only the Taliban but also with the IS, the current form of the Al-Qaeda terrorist networks, which have regrouped. Some of them split off from the Taliban, and the drugs. This is 80% of the world's heroin comes from Afghanistan. A lot of that because the British, when we moved in there 20 years ago, the British insisted that they wanted to run Helmand province, which is the core center of the heroin production, opium and heroin production. And the British, of course, have always run the global drug trade, and they wanted to make sure that it continued because the Western banking system is largely dependent, you might say. My cat is joining me.
What's your cat's name?
Kimmy Il-sung.
Okay. Hi, Kimmy.
But you know, they ran Helmand, and the drug production has multiplied multiple times. I once talked to an American colonel who had been working in Afghanistan, and I said, "Why in the world are we not cracking down on the drugs?" And he said, "Oh, well, the drug lords know who the bad guys are, so of course we work with them." Which, of course, is a lunacy. The drug trade is the basis of the funding of the terrorist operation, has been from the beginning, and still is today. So if we just walk away, you're going to have, again, the threat of terrorism, but even more deadly in terms of every American and every citizen of the world, you're going to have a massive expansion of heroin. 80% of the world's heroin comes from Afghanistan, and it's increased 45% over the last year in Afghanistan. So they snuck away in the mid of night. Why? Why did they leave Bagram Air Base in the middle of the night? It's because we don't trust the people we trained. We didn't want them to know when we were leaving, so we slipped out in the middle of the night. Even the looters knew before the Afghan government and military did. So what's the problem? The problem is not the foolish idea that, oh, we shouldn't have pulled out of Iraq, we should have stayed in, and that's why ISIS was formed. That's nonsense. The problem is that we did nothing to develop Afghanistan. When we first went in, Mr. Larouche said this is crazy for NATO to go in there to try to deal with the Al-Qaeda problem in Afghanistan. We should be working with every nation in the region, which means China, it means India, it means Iran, it means Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and Pakistan. We should be working with them because this is a problem for all of these countries. And had we done that, and had we started from the perspective that we were going to finally develop Afghanistan, not being the graveyard of empires, as it's known, but as the pivot for the Belt and Road project, a connecting point between Europe and Asia, between South Asia and Russia, a crossroads that can be developed economically and as a development corridor. But we didn't do that. Instead, we went in there and killed a lot of people, set up various puppet governments, got rid of Al-Qaeda and company, but the Taliban basically continued. And remember that the Taliban, there's things good and bad, you can say mostly bad about the Taliban, but they were created by Pakistan in order, their Pushtun crowd, the majority, I don't know the percentages, but more than half of the population is Pushtun. Both the government that we have supported there under Karzai and now Ghani are Pushtun, and the Taliban is Pushtun. Basically Sunni Muslims, and there are many other ethnic groups there, Uzbeks, Tajiks, Uyghurs from China. But the Pakistan interest was to make sure that the Pashtuns were in charge of Kabul, because after World War II, a certain piece of Afghanistan was sort of taken over by Pakistan, which a lot of Pashtuns. And there was a push for a Pushtun, a broader Pushtun area, Pashtunistan, perhaps you'd call it. And that would have been a real problem for Pakistan. So they wanted to back the Pushtun groups, both the so-called government side and the Taliban side, in order to make sure that there was not some sort of a push that would get the Pashtuns mobilizing for a broader fight. And there's much, much more that can be said about this. But this is what you're dealing with there. This is, the graveyard of empires, as they said. So Larouche, from the beginning, said you have to work with the countries in the region, and in particular, you have to develop it. You have to bring the Belt and Road idea of developing infrastructure as a way of escaping from poverty, which is the way China escaped from poverty and the way they are taking their policy of building basic infrastructure into Africa, South America, and Asia in order to help countries for the first time in their lives to become modern industrial countries rather than puppet regimes under colonialism or under the neo-colonialism of the IMF and the World Bank. So we didn't do that. And now we're getting out. Okay, we got to get out. But we have to bring about a development of Pakistan, or those drugs are going to be killing our kids again. And terrorism may be killing our people again. This is not an issue over there. All right, this is a nation which has been used by the British Empire to run drugs historically. And it is also where the terrorist apparatus was homed for a while in order to run the operations, not only against the US, but against other countries that might have bucked the IMF policies. So what's happening right now is quite extraordinary. The US announced it was getting out, it pulled out of Bagram, and all of a sudden we have a whole slew of development programs being discussed. I'll give you a little bit of background on this. We first published our development program in 1997 when we published a long report, 300 or 400 pages, on the conference that we organized in China. Helga Zepp Larouche as the primary organizer and a keynote speaker on the Belt and Road, or what became later known as the Belt and Road, on the new Silk Road, or the Eurasian Land Bridge. And as part of that program, we developed a infrastructure, railroad infrastructure connecting Asia with Europe, which of course went right straight through Pakistan, the old Silk Road. That was published at that time. Now, it didn't work, of course, nobody adopted it. The Chinese did slowly. But later, in 2012, Viktor Ivanov, one of the top aides to Vladimir Putin, and a good friend of the LaRouche movement, who was head of the anti-drug policy for the Russians, presented a 14-page document of extensive development of Afghanistan: rail, road, hospitals, schools, infrastructure, a very comprehensive plan, working with the nations in the region in order to make it interconnected, working with China, working with Iran, working with the Uzbeks and Tajiks to the north of Afghanistan. And that was going to be printed, that was going to be presented at the G8 meeting. You remember what the G8 was, John? You remember that term?
G7 plus one.
Yeah, they had Russia in it for a while. So it was the G8. Well, there was a meeting of the G8 scheduled for Sochi in Russia in June or July of 2014. And Viktor Ivanov was going to be the representative. He was going to present this program to try to get the entire Western advanced nations involved in really solving the Afghan problem by bringing this extensive development into the region. Well, you remember what happened in February of 2014? That's when the Obama administration and Victoria Nuland and George Soros decided to run a neo-Nazi coup in Ukraine. They openly backed the Hitler's ally in Ukraine, Stepan Bandera, and his followers today, carrying their swastikas and screaming racist diatribes against Russians and Poles and Jews and whatever. And we overthrew the elected government. In the name of democracy, of course, we supported a neo-Nazi movement overthrowing an elected government. And then we blamed Russia. So that G8 meeting never happened. Russia was thrown out. It became the G7 again. And the Sochi meeting never happened. And the policy was never presented. So Viktor Ivanov gave it to us, to the EIR, to the Larouche movement. We published it in our first land bridge book, the 370-page thing called the New Silk Road Becomes the World Land Bridge. We had a whole section on Central and South Asia, and we included an appendix sort of this Russian program. So we published it, and EIR published it later separately to let it be known. So this is the background. So now they're leaving. So what's happened over this last week? It's really quite extraordinary. There are meetings of the Afghan government and representatives of the Taliban going on in Moscow, in Beijing, and in Tehran. Now, the Taliban representatives that have been meeting with U.S. representatives in Qatar, I think, in Doha, they're generally probably not really representative of the Taliban generals. But these are representatives of the actual fighting force, Taliban, and the government, who are meeting in all three of these areas. And what are they discussing? They're discussing real development. And the most exciting is one called the Khyber Pass Development Corridor. And you can put that map up, Aaron. This is a proposal to take what's known as the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, CPEC, they call it, which has been this phenomenal development of Pakistan by China, collaborative with China, building a highway and a rail that goes all the way from China through Pakistan down to the Gwadar port, the new port they're building in the south. So this China-Pakistan economic corridor passes through Islamabad. Now, if you look at a map, most people don't know this map. I didn't know it that well. I had to look. But if you look at in Afghanistan at Islamabad, the capital, which is sort of in the north, about in the central, and in between that and Kabul, which is over in Afghanistan, is a city called Peshawar on the northern part of Afghanistan. Move that map down a little bit. So they're talking about the rail that now goes from China down through Pakistan through Islamabad to have a spike that goes off from Islamabad through Peshawar in Pakistan into Kabul, and not stopping there, but going north from Kabul into both Uzbekistan, to the capital of Uzbekistan, which is Tashkent, and slightly to the east to Dushanbe in Tajikistan. This would make Afghanistan part of this extraordinary, massive development project, which has brought development really for the first time into Pakistan, and for which every nation on earth outside of the US British tribe are looking at this as the model that can actually bring their countries out of backwardness and into modern industrial economies. It's probably the best model of what the Belt and Road can do. So this is a proposal, and they call it the Khyber Pass Development Corridor. Now I looked this up this afternoon because I remembered vaguely that the Khyber Pass is really a problem for the British. And what I found out here was that there was a British-Afghan war that started in 1839, and by 1842 they had taken over Kabul, and they were being pushed out of Kabul in a sort of upsurge by the Afghan people and the various tribes. And they drove down to the Khyber Pass, which is the way you get from Afghanistan into Pakistan. It's where this new development corridor will pass. And on the way, the tribes all over Afghanistan rose up and literally wiped out the entire British army and their hangers-on. They were literally slaughtered. One British soldier made it back to Islamabad, which was then in India, of course. So the idea that this is called the Khyber Pass Development Corridor probably is causing some people to lose sleep and chew some rugs back in London today. But it's a powerful idea. It's the only way, not only for Afghanistan, but for all of Africa, all of South America. It's the only way we are going to end the scourge of economic decay, of terrorism, of drug infestation, is with development. Larouche's idea that we have to bring the world together to actually unleash the kind of development program that Franklin Delano Roosevelt intended to launch after World War II, had he not died and a puppet president, Truman, been put in there to carry out the British bidding. It's possible. It's, of course, very difficult. It's coming at a time that the world is sitting on the brink of a possible war between the U.S. and Russia and the U.S. and China, if the war hawks in London and New York and Washington get their way, which would be nuclear, which could be the end of civilization as we know it. While we're in the midst of the worst pandemic in modern history, which requires, as Helga Zepp-LaRouche has insisted, not just that we get vaccines around the world, which of course we have not done. We have literally hoarded the vaccines from the vast majority of the world. But that won't solve it. We have to get modern health facilities in every country in the world. And modern health facilities requires more than vaccines and more than hospitals. It requires electricity and clean water. If those who watched our conference on June 26th and 27th will know that we are close to bringing together leading retired U.S. military, farmers, Russians, and others around the Schiller Institute to begin the process of actually doing what has to be done to end this pandemic and any coming pandemics, which is to bring modern medical facilities to the rest of the world, what Helga calls the coincidence of opposites, named after Nicholas of Cusa. And if you want an example of what a coincidence of opposites is, Afghanistan is the perfect example. It's the graveyard of empires. Everybody is in conflict. Nobody has pacified Afghanistan. It's a conflict between the British and the Russians and between the Chinese and whoever else. How do you solve that? You rise to a higher level. You have all these opposites fighting over their own interests. You rise to a higher level, as Nicholas of Cusa said. You go to a one above the many, which addresses the common aims of mankind. And if there's ever been a place where development is absolutely essential for every human being on earth, it's Afghanistan, because this is the playground of the British Empire. The drugs, the terrorism, the conflict between China and India, and so forth and so on. You rise above that through the idea of peace through development. And this is exactly where we are now and where we can and must make this moment before it breaks down into just Taliban sweeping through and taking over and bringing back terrorism. The Taliban basically would go along with a real development program, which allowed them to be at least co-governments, and in which there was going to be a real transformation of Afghanistan into a modern nation.
Well, I like your plan. I think it's a great plan. I have a few questions that have come up along the way as you've been giving us your read on Afghanistan. One of them is based upon my own studies of my father's career, which I've just finished writing a book about my dad, and that has required me to study with great detail the Vietnam-Laos conflict in which the United States was involved, both overtly and secretly. And my dad's career, unfortunately, was pretty much taken up by that. And I take it as absolutely proven. I don't have any question in my mind that the drug trade was created. Well, created. It's always been there through but let's pick up with Kuomintang and Chiang Kai-shek. And after World War II, they're in Burma, they're in northern Laos. They have no way to support themselves except for through drugs, and that's been the traditional way anyway. I mean, a bag of opium serves as currency in many of these places. Well, the Air America, the Hallowell Plan, all this stuff happened, and it happened because the CIA and its allies, but the CIA wanted to use that vast amount of money that they could get from the drug trade in order to do their next deals and to facilitate their next takedown of the next country and the next country. And all of this, running all this off the books, went on at least until the end of the Vietnam War. At that point, I think that they had found a way to do the heroin trade without having to go through Saigon anymore. So they just said, all right, let's pick up and move. Now, how could it possibly be that the heroin trade in Afghanistan is not also involved with the CIA and also involved with the people that have been running these secret covert operations ever since World War II off the books? Because, hey, they know Congress wouldn't pay for it, but it's got to be done. So, we're going to do this. We're going to run it through these money laundering banks like HSBC and the Nuke Hand Bank and all of this, the fraud, the ripoff of people, the willingness to just destroy a country, to destroy Vietnam, to destroy Cambodia, Laos, destroy everywhere they go to. Afghanistan is no different in that regard. So it looks to me like the secret policy all along has been to simply destroy it. And under the cover of, we're building democracy. We're going to help them build their country. But I never believed it. I don't believe it today. Yeah. And I think that we're walking out because that's our policy, is to leave chaos behind.
Yeah, George Bush and Obama absolutely destroyed Iraq, Libya, and Syria.
Yeah.
Under the name of bringing democracy. Was there any democracy there? Of course not. Totally destroyed nations. And now in the one case where the U.S. is still involved in Syria, we have the Caesar sanctions, which literally sanction any country on earth which dares to try to rebuild Syria now that they've largely defeated the ISIS operation there. Yeah, this is evil incarnate. It's very clear. I would only add one thing to what you said about the drugs. The money, yes, because the international drug banking system is drug dependent. They need that flow of huge sums of money to keep the banking system afloat. But it's not only for money. The British Opium War was not just for money. It was to keep the Chinese drugged up.
Yeah.
And the drug wars against the United States, George Bush Sr., George H.W. Bush, who we have documented in our book Dope Incorporated, was running drugs out of Central America under the guise of sending in arms to help the Contras in Nicaragua against the horrible communists. Those planes were going in with guns and coming back loaded with drugs, being turned into cocaine and coke, and introducing the whole coke generation in both the West Coast and in Florida as a way of drugging up the inner city and ultimately also the suburbs to reach the situation we have today, which is an absolute abomination in terms of not only the drugging up of whole generations, but now openly, this woman, Cori Bush, a congresswoman from, I forget, Mississippi perhaps, she and another Democrat have just introduced legislation into the Congress to legalize all drugs for personal use, including heroin and fentanyl. These killer drugs, who even if they don't kill you, destroy your mind, including marijuana, which people are now learning the devastation of what's happened from the legalization of pot throughout the country to what's happening to our kids. But, this is the policy of the CIA, the British intelligence, and so forth for those reasons. And it's absolutely true in Southeast Asia. There's no question that the so-called Golden Triangle of northern Thailand and Laos and Myanmar, Burma, that whole area. I had the opportunity while I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Thailand. I met some, I won't say who, but some people who asked me to interpret for them on a mule ride up through the northern hills, where they were actually looking for the Chinese mule trains that were from the KMT crowd. And I would distinguish them from the Chiang Kai-shek leadership in Taiwan. But nonetheless, they were KMTers who were, in fact, running the opium up into China in mule trains. And it was then being processed by the anti-regime people in China. So the book Dope Incorporated is still valuable, although it was written in the 1970s and 80s. Those of you who haven't read it, you can still get a copy by writing into Executive Intelligence Review and getting a copy of Dope Inc., the British War Against America, I think it's called, Dope Inc. So yeah, you're right. We also started a war on drugs movement back in the 1980s, which Lyndon LaRouche coined the word war on drugs. And we were hated by the drug lobby. They called us monsters because we were trying to take away their dope, is the way the High Times magazine called it. But this is core. I mean, the issue of whether we're going to defeat the economic collapse of the Western world, the threat of nuclear war, the colonial wars that we've been engaged in, the cultural decay, it depends on a real cultural renaissance. People have to learn to think like human beings and not like manipulated animals, which means you think about the human race as a whole. You think about what we do in this short span of time that we have here on Earth, and that when we pass, be we young or old, we have to look back and say, what have we done to actually bring the human race, which is the only eternal body, no individual is eternal, we're all mortal, but the human race is immortal. And what have we done to make sure that that human race is better off? What have we done to advance our conquering of space? What have we done to advance human knowledge of science, of art, of culture? And of course, we look back at the last several generations now in the United States and most of Europe, and you can only say that it has been the generation, not generation, that we are threatening the future of humanity by not doing what we are capable of doing as human beings, to use our creative powers given to us by God, the imago viva Dei of the biblical tradition, to solve these issues and bring about a renaissance for mankind as a whole. This is what we can do and we must do. This is what the Schiller Institute and the LaRouche organization are demonstrating is possible with our conferences, by bringing people from around the world together to discuss the common aims of mankind, and to show that the British idea that there is no such thing as a common aim for mankind, that we are basically just animals of different races, different ethnicities, and it's not human nature to get along and to work together. But it's a zero-sum game. We have to get ahead by putting down the other guy, that this is not what the human being is. This is the British imperial mentality that's been adopted, unfortunately, by those in this country who have allowed this old British imperial thinking to come to dominate most of our nation today.
Yes, and that's where I can't understand how we are going to attack this problem, because as much as I love the ideas that you've given us this evening, I don't see anybody going to make a move to make them happen. How do you get a General David Petraeus to look at life the way you look at it? It's not going to happen. How do you get the CIA generally to start acting in respect of humanity generally, and not simply their own particular pet projects?
Well, while we are speaking, John, Ray McGovern, who was the leading Russian expert for the CIA for 20, 30 years, I forget how long, and was one of the founders of the Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, the VIPs. He is speaking right now on the Friday night webcast of Diane Sayre, the member of our organization, who is also running for Senate against Charles Schumer in New York, and who's running Friday night forums. I hate to tell your audience to miss your show on Friday night, but she has a Friday night forum as well. And tonight, Ray McGovern is addressing it on Afghanistan as well as on drugs. Very much probably along the lines of what I'm saying, but from an extremely informed point of view. Somebody who is, in fact, one of the leading former CIA who recognizes the evil that was done in the name of American intelligence and who has given his life to combat that. But look, I want to say something else. How do we deal with it? When you look around and you look at Americans and I think there's a real change going on in the United States. I'm finding more and more in the people I talk to and my organizing and so forth, that the common response of, oh, come on, that doesn't affect me anyway, and they're not going to let it get too bad, that's disappearing. People know we're in a crisis of biblical proportions, you could say. They know that we're suddenly seeing massive inflation, and the government saying, oh, it's temporary, don't worry. Well, this is not temporary. They've just pumped $7 trillion in the last 2.5 years in to bail out the banking system. And that money is now driving a hyperinflationary policy like what we saw in Germany in 1923, when all of a sudden your currency, your savings, your paycheck became worthless. And that's what we're threatened with in that. And people are beginning to see that. And they're beginning to see that these wars just go on, and that we're playing nuclear chicken with Russia and China, and that their kids are coming home, they're not sure what sex they are, and they're taking drugs. I mean, this is a moment of crisis of civilization in which Lyndon LaRouche, when I first met him in 1971, said, nobody's really going to want to listen to our warning of where we're going if they don't listen to our policies. One or two people here and there build an organization, but when this happens, they're going to look back and say, who's been telling me the truth and who's been lying? And at this moment, people look back and see that LaRouche was right, that he was telling the truth. So I think it's wide open. But let me say also, if you want to know how we win, let me tell you something that happened on July 6th, just a few days ago in Beijing. This was the ongoing celebration of the Chinese Communist Party of their 100th anniversary. And Xi Jinping was chairman at a meeting of representatives of parties and organizations, 500 parties and organizations from around the world, from 160 countries. Now, I don't remember how many countries there are in the world, but this was at least 3/4 of the world's population represented by these organizations, who were totally enthralled with the idea that what China has done is a miracle, lifting 700 million people out of poverty, building the most powerful industrial scientific infrastructure nation the world has ever seen in 30 or 40 years. And through the Belt and Road, telling nations they don't have to remain backward, impoverished nations anymore if they use what ironically is an American system method as used by our founding fathers, Hamilton, Franklin, infrastructure, what they called internal improvements in America. But what they're doing is saying infrastructure is the key to breaking out of the bottleneck of poverty. So 160 nations were represented. Let me read you a couple of quotes from Xi Jinping's opening speech, just so you get a sense. Development holds the key to a people's well-being. On the road to the well-being of all mankind, no country or nation should be left behind. All countries and nations are equally entitled to development opportunities and rights to development. The eradication of poverty has been a common aspiration of people of all countries and an important objective of all political parties strive to achieve. China has lifted our country out of poverty 10 years ahead of the UN 2030 agenda for sustainable development, which is supposedly going to end abject poverty. And the Communist Party of China is willing to contribute more Chinese solutions and Chinese strength to the poverty reduction process worldwide. International rules should be based on universally recognized norms rather than the rules of the few. You always hear China and Russia don't follow the rules-based order. Whose rules? Whose rules? These are not international laws like the UN Charter. These are the rules that say you have to follow our dictates. And this is what Xi Jinping is refuting, not the rules of the few. Cooperation among countries should aim at serving all mankind instead of seeking hegemony by way of group politics. China will always be a member of the developing world. And he doesn't mean that we're not going to become developed, but that we will always be with the poor. Now, this is what Roosevelt used to say. This was the four freedoms. This is American, right? And you think China's fooling? You believe Pompeo or Anthony Blinken that China is trying to take over the world and impose their system on the world? This is sick. The idea that China is isolated in the world, as demonstrated by 10,000 people who were watching this thing, right? Who's isolated? The US, imposing sanctions on dozens and dozens of countries for no reason. Who do they hurt? They hurt the common citizens. These Caesar sanctions are killing people in Yemen, in Syria, in Venezuela, Cuba, killing people. And yet this is what we call democracy. Well, it's not. It's not only not democracy, but it's very, very close to people recognizing that this is Hjalmar Schacht, the Nazi economic minister under Hitler. These are policies of death. So this can and it must be reversed. Don't think that, well, this is too big a job, we can't do it. What you think is, if we don't achieve this, what are the consequences? Nuclear war, global pandemic, genocide. This pandemic is not over just because it's slowed down in the United States. It's spiking all over India, Brazil, Argentina, Peru, Africa, right? Why? Because we haven't sent practically a single vaccine to anybody, only the Russians and the Chinese, and they can't do it on their own, right? And because these countries have no health care, which is why our country was unable to deal with the pandemic. Right? It's because under Bush and Obama, going back to Nixon, actually, when they privatized healthcare, our health system has been taken down, and Trump told the truth when the thing first hit. He said, our cupboard is bare. We don't have the capacity to deal with this. And that was telling the truth. And then he was convinced he had to have somebody to blame. So he started blaming China. That's what I have to say in that article you brought up before, John, about why Trump lost, why he failed. And why people who support him often fail to understand why he failed. Because everything he fought for that won the American people to support him, getting out of these damn wars, being friends with Russia. Remember, being a friend of Russia is a good thing, not a bad thing, he said over and over and over again, right? And then becoming a close friend of China, praising China as a great nation under a great leader, Xi Jinping, after he brought Xi Jinping here and went to visit China. So unfortunately, he hired all of the neocon and anti-China and Wall Street and military industrial crowd to be his cabinet. because he wasn't willing to exonerate Lyndon LaRouche and bring on people who actually believed in those things he was fighting for at first. And as a result, he ended up basically failing on every single policy he was trying to implement. And that's what you've got to recognize, that we are dealing here with either we do the entire thing, a new renaissance, a new global policy of working hand in hand with great nations around the world, what LaRouche called the four powers, Russia, China, India, and the United States, bringing them together on board for the common aims of mankind, that which the British Empire says doesn't exist. Right? That's where we stand.
Sorry, I had myself muted. Anyway, yeah, let's go back to Afghanistan for where we were talking about. Let's start with the idea of the Belt and Road, and the idea I came up with for the show is kind of, is it going to be the Belt and Road or is it going to be chaos? Where are the Chinese in terms of actually making a deal with Afghanistan, and here we're going to build, we're going to go through the Khyber Pass from Pakistan. Well, they're going to have Pakistan on board first. I understand. I've just recently noted that, at least maybe it's just a headline, but people in Pakistan are quite upset that Afghanistan is going to become lawless. I mean, that's horrible for Pakistan, because Pakistan is practically lawless already. And the people there, they cherish their country, they cherish their institutions, and very, but a very, very large majority of uneducated people that are easily swayed and pulled this way and that way. When they brought all the guns in with the Mujahideen. That was a terrible thing for Pakistan, and now we're going to have lawlessness in Afghanistan right across the Khyber Pass, and yeah, that's a terrible thing for Pakistan. How is that going in terms of China actually moving in that direction? And I don't think there's any hope the United States is going to participate in this plan. So I mean, it's kind of like trying, if Trump couldn't do these things, then I don't see how anybody's going to be able to do it while Biden's in the office. So we're not going to participate in something as good for humanity as building this Belt and Road. How do you see China proceeding? Uh-oh.
Not as advanced as China is now, but it's in that direction. They know that, like I said, the Pakistan largely created the Taliban, and they basically are supporting both sides in the government versus the Taliban struggle. They're both Pashtuns. That's what I was talking about earlier. But they know, as they know in their own country, that if you're going to transform Afghanistan, it has to be through development. The development like they have seen in their own country for the first time, really, in history. I mean, they did a lot on their own. They had good scientists and so forth. But what's been done in collaboration with China has been phenomenal, a model to the whole world.
You're speaking of Pakistan now?
Yeah, Pakistan. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor is just this phenomenal development of power plants, roads, railroads, infrastructure, industry, development corridors around Gwadar Port in the south. I mean, you could go through it for a long time because it's a huge project and a demonstration to the world, to Africa, to South America, of what can happen if you're working collaboratively on real development, building infrastructure, not just getting loans, not just getting aid, but building infrastructure. Mm-hmm. And that idea, the Pakistanis know very well, if you can pull that off, it's the only thing that could transform Afghanistan from being the graveyard of empires into a real nation. The Chinese have been trying to bring that idea into Afghanistan since about the beginning of the war, probably back in 2001. They already had the idea of the New Silk Road, what they called the Eurasian Land Bridge, which would go through Afghanistan. the old Silk Road. They especially tried to bring it in during the middle of this since Xi Jinping came in and adopted the Belt and Road program. They've been trying to get that into Pakistan. But, the U.S. wouldn't let that happen. They do have a big copper mine in Afghanistan, but they have not been allowed to actually develop any real infrastructure there. But they're discussing it right now. They're discussing this Khyber Pass economic corridor to expand on the China-Pakistan economic corridor. It's very real that this could happen. It's not going to be easy. There are a lot of people who want to keep the chaos, the great game, the British used to call it, when they were fighting with Russia over who was going to control Central Asia. But this is something that can happen. It's possible. And the way Larouche always looked at these things is that you don't just say, well, gee, let's be practical. Let's see what we can get done within the current circumstances. No, you have to be a prophet. Not just Lynn, not just Larouche, but all of us. You have to look at the world from 50 years in the future. And you have to see that the future determines the present. And you have to say, here's what has to exist 50 years from now, or even 100 or 1,000 years from now. And to get there, here's what must happen. And then you lay that out, and many people will say, oh, well, that's not, that's a daydream. You're naive. You think human beings are going to support a policy that helps the human race? Forget it. This is the cynicism that they inculcate in you. And when you have a culture like ours, where people have been given no access to anything true or beautiful, all you get is ugliness and drugs and perversity and, what's in it for me, and, how do I satisfy my sensual impulses? Not how do I develop the creative powers of my mind, which is the source of true happiness. When our founding fathers took the words of Leibniz and said that we are born with certain inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Happiness didn't mean feeling good, getting laid, getting drugs. Feeling good, or rather being happy, came from knowing that you were using your mind to make new discoveries and conveying those new discoveries to others in a way which is going to leave a lasting contribution to humanity when we pass on, as we all do. That's what happiness meant to Leibniz, who was the inspiration for the real founding fathers, Cotton Mather and Benjamin Franklin, the people who built this nation, the best of the European culture, the inventor of the calculus, and a great scientific mind, and a diplomat, Leibniz, who most Americans don't even know who that is. But he's the founding father of America. And it's these ideas, if you want to understand our Constitution and our Declaration of Independence, you have to learn who these people are, Nicholas of Cusa, Leibniz, and so forth. And they are alive today. These are the people whose living ideas have the basis on which we can actually resolve this crisis and bring about a true renaissance for mankind.
Well, I'll admit that I'm not very good at looking at that big picture, the 100 years or the 1,000 years, and the projecting out as you've just done, and saying, it's obvious this is where we have to go. So let's figure out how to get there and work on it from a point of view of reason. I love the ideas. I just wish that we had politicians that were not already beholden to this system, this as Doug Valentine's recent book, "The CIA as Organized Crime," shows us that this whole economy has been invaded by drug money. It's dependent, as you've said, on the drug money. Afghanistan is the source of 80% of the heroin, and who's going to control it now is I wish China would come in there. I wish China would build this Belt and Road, but
in the U.S. even
it threatens the system, does it not? To pacify, to give Afghanistan real development instead of dependence upon a drug trade. It threatens these institutional criminals that have been running our financial system.
Well, the system is broken. We know that now. The system is broken. You cannot reverse the current massive decline into economic depression, into financial explosion within this system. This system is no longer the American system. When Kennedy was killed, what happened? Two things happened. Everybody knows that they killed Kennedy because he didn't want to go to war in Vietnam. And they got Johnson, who had some good qualities. He believed in Roosevelt. He wanted to electrify the nation, but he knew nothing about foreign policy. I could give you some quotes. And they very easily manipulated him into this hideous Vietnam War, which was the end of America as an American system. We became a colonial power. But worse than that, which most people don't know, is that that's when the idea that we had to follow the idea of the independence of the Federal Reserve, that we must not allow the government to interfere in the free market. This is British. The Hamiltonian system was that your elected government, responsible to the people, directs credit into those areas of infrastructure, industry, schools, hospitals, and so forth needed for the general welfare of the population. That was the American system, the directed credit. We were more a creditary system than a monetary system. And what became the dominant thing once they got Kennedy out of the way, got Roosevelt out of the way first. They were very lucky that they got him to die before the war was end, and Truman would commit genocide with the nuclear bombs and would help the British and the French back into their colonies. That's a long story. But when Kennedy died, who tried to revive that tradition, when he was killed rather, then this whole British system of economics came in. Free market, free trade. Government stay out of things. Let the free market run it, which means what? It means let the banks determine the policies, right? And they then took down the Glass-Steagall and other bills that Roosevelt had built, which allowed massive speculation, especially during the 1990s. They eliminated Glass-Steagall. By the time George W. Bush came in, there was nothing but massive speculation. Money was not going into the real economy. Our real economy began to decline. People started taking their industries overseas for cheap labor because they did not have a way of actually making profit in an American economy that was declining. Not to excuse them, but that's what they were doing, because they were being told to think of the bottom line, short-term profit, not the long-term profit of the nation, which comes from government direction of credit, not ownership of all the means of production, but the direction of credit into those things that are useful. You don't issue credit to build whorehouses. You build credit to build steel mills and scientific endeavors and space programs. That's the American system. Now, we've given that up. We now have, not only are the banks taking policy away from the government itself, but what is the policy they're implementing? You've discussed this on your other shows, John. It's the Green New Deal, cutting credit to any fossil fuel or any industry or agriculture which emits too much carbon, which they say is causing climate change, a scientific fraud, a hoax. But they're taking power away from elected governments here and in Europe, and they're trying to do it around the world, right? And putting it in the hands of bankers who are going to cut credit to anything productive in order to force credit into bailing out this massive bankrupt banking system, this bubble of $2 quadrillion. It's impossible to imagine what $2 quadrillion of derivatives is. A quadrillion is 1,000 trillion. And there's $2 quadrillion of this gambling debt sitting out there, which requires to be fed by looting the real economy. And this is what's about to blow apart, either into a hyperinflation or into a total collapse. But this is the American system is still in the back of people's minds. They have a sense of American progress, that we can build things. We can go to the moon. We can go to Mars. And on that, I think Trump did a good job by reviving the Artemis program. and began to inspire people again, although he gave in to the anti-China, anti-Russia stuff, and we're not collaborating with even with Russia, who helped us build the space station. It was the one area of real collaboration between the U.S. and Russia was our space program, NASA. Now that's not part of it anymore, let alone China. So, you know, but we have the potential, because the situation is as bad as it is. There's every reason to be optimistic that people will respond if you're telling them the truth, which is both the extreme danger, which they recognize now, but also that the solution depends upon a global solution, collaborating with what should be our friends around the world, especially in Russia and China.
Well, I think we should leave it right there. Collaborating with our friends around the world is a nice way to leave it. That's the vision for the next 100 years. Collaborating with our friends around the world, solving the healthcare problem, and just standing down from all this military stuff, because it's really not necessary. This whole idea of scarcity is all generated in order to keep the derivative flying and the overly papered financial system going. And I do think the last point you made about the carbon credits is probably their Achilles heel, because I think they've built their whole world around the idea that people are going to actually consider a carbon credit as something worthy of buying and worthy of paying money for. Yeah. And I think that is maybe their downfall, because if they think that they're going to be able to get people to lend money against carbon credits that are going to come in the future, I think they may have gone, you know, a bridge too far. Or
there is a revolt going on in the Midwest against this entire carbon thing. The governor of Texas today ordered the state to begin giving preference to coal and oil and gas, not windmills and undependable windmills and solar panels, which gave them the disaster in February that they went through. There's a revolt, especially against this Green New Deal insanity.
Excellent. Well, I'm very glad to hear that, and more power to the governor of Texas. And more power to you, Mike Billington. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you, John.
Good night, everybody.